7 months out into space, while Rimmer sat at his slanting architect's desk under the pink glow of his study lamp, Lister stared out of the sleeping quarters viewport window, longing to be bored again. He'd been not going out with Kochanski now for 3 weeks. The whole affair, the glorious forever he'd imagined, had lasted just over a month. Then, one evening in her sleeping quarters, as Lister arrived to take her to a movie, she told him she wanted to break it off. He'd laughed. He thought it was a joke. But it wasn't. She'd been seeing Tom, or was it Tim, a flight navigation officer for almost 2 years. Tom, or Tim, it may have been Tony, had left her for a fling with some brunette in catering, and Lister had been a rebound thing. She hadn't realized it at first, but when Tom, Tim, Tony, or Terry, or whatever the smeggy was called, had turned up at her door, having dumped the brunette in catering, she'd gone scurrying back. There were tears, there were apologies, and pathetic cliched platitudes. They could still be friends. If he met Trevor, he'd really like him. She wished she were 2 people so she could love both of them, ad nauseum. She'd returned the blue jumper he'd left. She'd returned his DAT tapes and offered to give back the necklace he'd bought her, which of course he declined. And that was that. Except it wasn't. Because now she was everywhere. Everything he did without her. Everywhere he went without her. When he went shopping, he didn't go shopping. He went shopping without Kochanski. When he went to the bar, he didn't go to the bar. He went to the bar without Kochanski. She'd infected every part of his life. His mental map of the ship now judged all distances in relation to her sleeping quarters or the drive room where she worked. He wasn't walking on such and such a corridor. He was walking on such and such a corridor which was N floors above or N floors below where she was at that precise moment. So he lay on his bunk, staring out of the viewport window, longing for the anesthetic of the stupefying monotony which he used to feel 2 short months earlier. His only relief from the Kochanski blues had been 3 days planet leave on the alcohol-dry Uranian moon Miranda, when Red Dwarf had docked for supplies. 3 days drinking cola and playing video machines with Peterson. Peterson, who'd got drunk every night of his life since he was 12, was so thrilled with the benefits of being sober, he'd gone teetotal overnight. So their excursions down to the Copacabana were a thing of the past, denying Lister his one last refuge. He sighed like a senile dog, and looked down at Rimmer, hard at work. "Do you fancy going for a drink?" he asked, knowing the answer would be no, even before he'd finished saying the word do. "No," said Rimmer without looking up. "That's a surprise. As it happens, I am going out tonight, just not with you." "What about your revision?" Rimmer had decided to change. His latest 3-month revision timetable had been constructed within 2 hours, and 4 hours a day, come what may, he read his course books, made notes, and revised in a sensible way. And revising in a sensible way obviously meant an adequate provision for leisure time. "Well, where are you going then?" "Out." "Where?" Rimmer ignored him. He was going to spend the evening not getting any older. He was going to spend it in a stasis booth. Red Dwarf, like most of the older ships, was equipped with stasis booths for interstellar travel. 100 years earlier, travelling to other star systems had been considered economically and philosophically interesting, but not anymore. To travel the vast distances involved, even with craft which could achieve demi-light speed, took decades. Necessity being the mother of invention, the stasis booth was duly invented. Basically, it was a foolproof form of suspended animation. But instead of freezing the body cryogenically and having all the attendant revival problems, the stasis booth simply froze time. Once activated, the booth created a static field of time. In the same way X-rays can't penetrate lead, time couldn't penetrate a stasis field. An object caught within the field became a non-event mass with a quantum probability of 0. In other words, the object remained in exactly the same state, at exactly the same age, until it was released. Most of the important groundwork for time freezing and stasis theory had been done by Einstein in the 1950s. Unfortunately, just as he was on the verge of the breakthrough, he started dating Marilyn Monroe, and basically lost interest in the project. Even after their short affair was over, he found it difficult to concentrate on quantum theory and spent much of the rest of his life taking cold showers. His notes on the theory were later discovered and developed, and the stasis booth was born. For a period, ships full of astros in stasis booths were hurled out of our solar system, and interstellar travel enjoyed its golden age. The big hope, of course, was that they'd contact intelligent life. They didn't. Not even a moderately intelligent plant. Not even a stupid plant. Nothing. And it was surmised correctly, although it wasn't confirmed for a further 2,000 years, that mankind was completely and totally and inexplicably alone. In all of the universe. In all of the universe, the planet Earth was the only planet with any life forms. That's all there was. Interstellar travel was abandoned as a total waste of time, and the returning stellarnauts tried to reintegrate into society and cope with the fact that many of them were now 50 years younger than their own children. This led to curious generation gap problems, which the greetings cards industry took full advantage of. Rimmer had a key card to one of Red Dwarf's stasis booths, which he used whenever he could. While morons like Lister and Peterson were urinating their lives down the gutter in the Copacabana Hawaiian cocktail bar, he was in a stasis booth, not existing, not getting any older. It made great good sense to Rimmer. Take tonight. There was nothing he particularly wanted to do. He'd achieved all the aims on his daily goal list, and under normal circumstances, he'd just lounge around doing not very much, and eventually going to bed. As it was, when they took to their bunks that night, Rimmer would be 3 hours less older than Lister. Because he wouldn't have lived those 3 hours. He'd have saved them. Saved them for when he really needed them. True, technically he wouldn't be living. But he didn't particularly want to live tonight. He wasn't in the mood. It was just like a bank, only instead of saving up money, he was saving up time. He'd been doing it on and off for about 5 years, and in this way, he used up most of his free leisure time. Most Sundays were spent boothing. And then usually 3 evenings a week for 3 hours or so. And obviously, if there were any bank holidays, he'd take full advantage of the facility not to exist, and pinch back a few hours from Father Time. In just 5 years, he'd saved 369 full days, over a full Earth year. In 5 years, he'd only lived for 4. Although his birth certificate said he was 31, technically, he was still only 30. Occasionally, Rimmer reflected that his boothing could possibly be the reason why he didn't have any friends. But as he pointed out to himself, if having friends meant having to hang around and get older with them, then he wasn't sure he wanted any, especially since the perks were so astonishing. He often looked in the full-length mirror, when Lister wasn't there, and reflected that, although he was 31, he still had the body of a 30-year-old. If he could maintain this routine, by the time his birth certificate said he was 90, he'd actually only be a very sprightly 78-year-old. Pretty a smegging mazing, eh? Lister slumped off to try and persuade Peterson to go for a drink. Rimmer watched him go, then showered and changed, treated himself to a little aftershave, and went off to spend the very last evening of his life not existing. On the very last morning of his life, Rimmer strode into the lecture theatre to give Z-Shift their work schedule for the day. "Okay, men," he said as always. "Listen up." As always, the whole of Z-Shift inclined their heads to one side and pointed their ears at the ceiling. But as always, Rimmer missed this as he turned his back to pull down the blackboard he'd prepared the day before. As always, his schedule wasn't there. What was there was a crudely drawn cartoon of a man making love to a kangaroo, wearing hugely exaggerated footwear covered in brown spit, and underneath in the same crude hand, "Old Tobacco Boots Goes Down Under." Nobody laughed. Rimmer looked round at a sea of blank faces. He'd long since given up referring to the blackboard insults. "Okay," he said, consulting his notes. "Today's schedule. Turner, Wilkinson, we've had a number of reports that machine 15455 is dispensing black currant juice instead of chicken soup. While you're down there, Corridor 14 Alpha 12 needs new crunchy bars. Thereafter, I want you to go down to the reference library and hygienize all the headsets in the language lab. Saxon and Burroughs continue painting the engineer's mess, and I want that finished today. McCulloch, Schmidt, Palmer, as yesterday. Bird, Dooley, Pixon. Laundrettes on East Alpha 555 report no less than 24 dryers out of commission. I want them up and drying by nightfall. Also, there's an unconfirmed rumor that the cigar machine in the officers' club is nearly empty. Now, it may be nothing, but just in case, for pity's sake, stay by a phone." A paper dart whistled past his head. "Okay, roll out. Lister, you're with me today." The men began to shuffle out. "Why me?" Lister moaned. "Because it's your turn." As always, just before the first man reached the door, Rimmer called out his team chant, which he hoped would catch on. "Hey, and remember, we are tough and we are mean. Rimmer's Z-Shift gets things clean." Z-Shift shuffled out silently. Two of the three worst things that ever happened to Rimmer on this day. The worst thing that ever happened was, of course, his death. But that was a clear 12 hours away. The second worst thing that ever happened had happened 13 months earlier, and was so horrible his subconscious had created a new sub-department to hide it from his waking thoughts. It involved a bowl of soup. The third worst thing that ever happened to Rimmer shortly after 10 o'clock, as he and Lister made their way towards Corridor 1, Gamma 755, to check, just to put Rimmer's mind at ease, that there was enough shower gel in the women's washroom. At first, it was Lister who had a horrible thing happen to him as he pushed his squeaky four-wheel hygiene truck along the steel mesh floor. First Technician Petrovich rounded the corner. Rimmer didn't like Petrovich. Petrovich, 3 years his junior, was his equal in rank, and leader of A Shift, the best shift. A Shift got all the plum jobs, the serious technical work, repairing porous circuits, and if that weren't bad enough, Petrovich had taken and passed the astronavigation exam the exact same time Rimmer had made his claims to fishhood, and was now merely waiting for his orders to be processed before he got his gold bar and took up the rank of Astronavigation Officer 4th Class. Also, he was good-looking, popular, charming, and amiable. All in all, as far as Rimmer could see, there wasn't a single thing to like about Petrovich. There'd been a wild rumor some months back that Petrovich was a drug dealer, and Rimmer did whatever he could to spread it. He didn't know whether it was true, but God, he hoped it was. Whenever he was feeling low, he entertained himself with visions of Petrovich having his badges of rank ripped from his uniform and being led away in manacles. Still, there was no evidence that it was true, so all Rimmer could do was keep spreading those malicious rumors and hoping. "What the smeg is wrong with your bleepers? I've been trying to get hold of you for an hour," said Petrovich. "Lister, the captain wants to see you." Rimmer looked dumbfounded. Why should the captain want to see Lister? In the ordinary course of things, Lister, being a lowly third technician, should go the whole trip without ever meeting the captain. Unless, thought Rimmer, brightening, he's in very, very deep smegola indeed. And by the slightly sick look of Lister's smile, Rimmer confidently surmised the very same thought had occurred to him. "Why does she want to see me?" "I think you know why," said Petrovich, his usual geniality completely absent. Lister dragged himself off towards the express lift. "Oh dear," said Rimmer breezily. "Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear," he tutted and shook his head. "Dearie me. Dearie, dearie, dearie me." Petrovich didn't smile, and made to follow Lister, but then stopped and turned. "What are you doing with Lister anyway? It's 10:05. "So?" said Rimmer. "I thought you were taking the astronavigation exam." "That's November the 27th, you square-jawed chump," said Rimmer with naked contempt. "No, it's October the 27th. "I think, Petrovich, I know when my own exam is, thank you so very, very much." "My bunkmate is taking it today." "Hollaback?" "Yeah, he went up at 10. Rimmer's smile remained exactly where it was, while the rest of his face sagged like a bloodhound's. He looked at his watch. 10:07. He tapped it a couple of times, and walked off without saying anything. Rimmer arrived breathless back at the sleeping quarters. He skidded to a halt in front of his timetable. His eyes scanned the chart for an error. He couldn't find one. He couldn't find one for a whole 2 minutes. Then he froze. In his haste not to dwell on the construction of the chart, somehow he'd included 2 Septembers. August, September, September, October, November, ran the new Romarian calendar. "How could I have included September twice and not noticed?" thought Rimmer, sucking his fist. "This is what happens when you spend most of your social life not existing." He looked at his watch. 10:35. He'd missed 35 minutes of a 3-hour exam. A strange calmness overtook him. Well, he could still get to the exam by, say, 10:45. If he kept his answers short and pertinent, it was still more than possible to pass. So far, so good. What was slightly trickier was going to be cramming a whole month's revision into minus 35 minutes. 35 minutes was hard enough, but minus 35 minutes, well, you'd have to be Doctor Who. As always, at crisis times in his life, Rimmer asked himself the question, what would Napoleon do? Something French, he thought. Probably munch on a croissant and decide to invade Russia. Not really relevant, he decided, in this particular scenario. What then? What then? The seconds ticked away. Then it came to him. He knew exactly what he must do. Cheat! Rimmer took out a black felt tip pen, stripped off his shirt and trousers, and began work. He estimated, 20 minutes to copy as much of his textbooks onto his body as humanly possible. Lister had never been up to the drive room before. It was enormous. Hundreds of people scurried along the network of gantries stretching above him. Banks of programmers in white officers' uniforms clacked away at computer keyboards in front of multicolored flashing screens arranged in a series of horseshoe shapes around the massive chamber. Scutters, the small service droids with 3-fingered clawed heads, joined to their motorized bases by triple-jointed necks, whizzed between the various computer terminals, transporting sheets of data. Occasionally a voice could be heard above the unrelenting jabber of hundreds of people talking at once. "Stop start OA3! Stop start OA3, thank you! At last! Stop start OA4! Is anybody listening to me?" Lister followed Petrovich as he zigzagged through a maze of towering columns of identical hard disk drives, as people pushed past them, desperate to get back to wherever they had to get back to. Up above them, Holly's bald-headed, digitalized face dominated the whole of the ceiling, patiently answering questions and solving quandaries, while dispensing relevant data updates from other areas of the ship. Through the computer hardware, Lister caught sight of Kachansky, expertly clicking away at a computer keyboard, happily going about her business just as if nothing had happened. Lister didn't exactly expect her to be sobbing guiltily onto her keyboard. But smiling? Actively smiling? It was obscene. Lister remembered reading in one of Rimmer's strange science mags that an Earth biochemist claimed he'd isolated the virus which caused love. According to him, it was an infectious germ which was particularly virulent for the first few weeks, but then, gradually, the body recovered. Looking at Kochanski, merrily tippy-tapping away, Lister was inclined to believe the biochemist had a point. She'd shrugged him off like a bout of dysentery. She'd recovered from him like he was a dose of flu. She was fine and dandy, back to normal. They climbed the gantry steps to the admin level, where glass-fronted offices wound round the entire chamber like the private boxes which skirted the London Jet 0G football stadium. 5 minutes later, they arrived outside the captain's office. Petrovich knocked, and they went in. "Lister, sir," said Petrovich, and left. The office looked like it had been newly burgled and freshly bombed. The captain was mumbling into a phone buried beneath gigantic reams of computer printout, surrounded by open ledgers and piles of memoranda. Lister shifted uncomfortably and waited for her to finish her call. "Well, you see he does exactly that," finished the captain, and before the phone had even hit its holder, and without looking up, she said, "Where's the cat?" "What?" said Lister. "Where's the cat?" repeated the captain. "What cat?" "I'm going to ask you one last time," she said, finally looking up. "Where is the cat?" "Let me get this straight," said Lister. "You think I know something about a cat, right?" "Don't be smart." The captain was actually smiling with anger. "Where is it?" "I don't know what you're talking about." "Lister, not only are you so stupid you bring an unquarantined animal aboard, not only that," she paused, "you have your photograph taken with the cat and send it to be processed in the developing lab. So let's make this the last chorus. Where's the cat?" "What cat?" "This one!" she shouted, pushing a photograph into Lister's face. "This goddamn cat!" Lister looked at the photograph of himself sitting in what were unmistakably his sleeping quarters, holding what was unmistakably a small black cat. "Oh, that cat." "Where'd you get it? Mimas?" "Miranda, when we stopped for supplies." "Don't you realize it could be carrying anything? Anything? What were you thinking of?" "I just felt sorry for her. She was just wandering the streets. Her fur was all hanging off." "Her fur was hanging off? Oh, this gets better and better." 2 of the captain's phones were ringing, but she didn't answer them. "And she had this limp, and she'd walk a few steps, then let out this scream, then walk a few more steps, then scream again." "Well, now I'm screaming, Lister. I want that cat, and I want it now. Do you think we just have quarantine regulations just for the hell of it? Just to make life a bit more unbearable? Well, we don't. We have them to safeguard the crew. A spaceship is a closed system. A contagious disease has nowhere else to go. Everybody gets it." "She's better now. Fur's grown back. I've fixed her leg. She's fine." "It's impossible to tell. You got the cat from a space colony. There are diseases out there, new diseases. The locals develop an immunity. Now get that cat down to the lab. Double time." "Sir." "You're still here, Lister." "What are you going to do with the cat?" "I'm going to have it cut up and run tests on it." "Are you going to put it back together when you're finished?" The captain closed her eyes. "You're not, are you?" persisted Lister. "You're going to kill it?" "Yes, Lister, that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to kill it." "Well, with respect, sir," said Lister, taking a cigarette from his hatband. "What's in it for the cat?" Lister smiled. The captain didn't. "Lister, give me the cat." Lister shook his head. "We'll find it anyway." "No, you won't." "Let me put it like this." The captain reclined back in her chair. "Give me the friggin' cat." "Look, she's fine. There's nothing wrong with her." "Give me the cat." "Apart from anything else, she's pregnant." "She's what?" "I want that cat." Lister shook his head again. "Do you want to go into stasis for the rest of the JAG and lose 3 years' wages?" "No." "Do you want to hand over the cat?" "No." "Choose." 11:05. Rimmer hurried out of the lift and down corridor 4, Delta 799, towards the exam hall. Under his high-neck zipped flight suit, he had everything he needed to pass the exam. On his right thigh, in tiny script, were all the basic principles of quantum mechanics. Time dilation formulae covered his right calf. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle took up most of his left leg, while porous circuit theory and continuum hypotheses filled his forearms. Rimmer had never done anything illegal before. He hadn't so much as got a parking ticket on his home moon Io. He'd never fiddled his expenses, which quite frankly even the captain did. He'd never cheated. Never. Not because he was of high moral character, but simply because he was scared. He was terrified of being caught. He walked into the clinically white exam room. The adjudicating officer glanced at his watch and nodded towards the one empty desk, where an exam paper lay face down, and returned to reading his novel. "He knows," thought Rimmer, his face glowing like Jupiter's red spot. "He knows from the way I walked into the room. He knows." Rimmer ducked his body low into his chair, so just his head remained above the tabletop, and peered past the backs of the examinees in front of him, waiting for the adjudicator to make his move. Waiting for him to leap forward and rip off his flimsy flight suit, exposing his shame. His illustrated body, Rimmer's cheating frame. For a full 10 minutes, Rimmer watched the officer quietly reading his novel. "All right," thought Rimmer. "Play it like that. The old cat-and-mouse game." Another 10 minutes went by. Still the officer taunted him by doing nothing. Nothing. At 11:45, Rimmer decided the adjudicator didn't know, and it was safe to begin. Safe to cheat. He turned over the exam paper and started to read the questions. Something appeared to be sucking oxygen out of the room, and he seemed to have to take 2 breaths to his usual one just to keep conscious. Bub-bub. 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 His heartbeat was deafening, and when someone turned round, he was convinced they were going to say, "Can you keep your heartbeat down a bit? I'm trying to concentrate." "Astronavigation, Part 1 Examination," he read. Then underneath, "Answer 5 questions only." Just 5, thought Rimmer. I'm not going to make that mistake again. Question 1. As he looked at the question, the letters seemed to come off the page and sway out of focus like distant figures disappearing in a heat haze on a desert road. He blinked. 2 tears of sweat ran past his eyes and tumbled onto the page. He ran his hands through his hair and wiped the perspiration off his face with his palms, then blinked twice more and brought the question into focus. "Oh, God," thought Rimmer. "I've forgotten how to read." He blinked several more times. Describe, using formulae where appropriate, the application of de Boer's theory of thermal induction in porous circuitry. That was his left forearm. The answer was there. The formulae were there. All he had to do was slide back his sleeve, copy it all down, and he was 1/5 of his way into that officers' club. He looked at the other questions. There were 3 others he could do, and he could do them perfectly. 80%. He only needed 40. There was a whole hour to go. He was an officer! Arnold J. Rimmer, Astronavigation Officer, 4th Class. Already in his mind's eye, ticker tape was cascading from rooftops as he sat in the open-top limousine, waving to the adoring Ionian crowds. He snapped out of it. No time for complacency. 15 minutes per question. It was enough. "Let's go, oh, 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 oh!" he screamed silently. He glanced nonchalantly around. No one was watching. Casually, he rested his hand on his wrist and slowly slid back the sleeve. The adjudicating officer turned a page in his novel. Rimmer looked down at his arm. An inky black blob stared up at him. His body had betrayed him. It had conspired to drench him in sweat, and dissolve his best chance ever of getting that glimmering gold bar. He looked at his right hand. The answer to the question, describe using formulae where appropriate the application of de Boer's theory of thermal induction in porous circuitry, was there somewhere, hiding in the black, blobby mess. Rimmer decided to take a chance in a million. It was the longest of long shots. With careful precision, he placed his inky hand on the answer sheet and pressed as hard as he could. Maybe, just maybe, when he removed his hand, his tiny copperplate writing would reassemble itself legibly on the page. He removed his hand. There, in the middle of the page, was a perfect palm print, with a single middle finger raised in mocking salute. An idiotic grin spread across Rimmer's face as he picked up his pen and signed the bottom of the page. Slowly he clambered to his feet, saluted the adjudicating officer, and woke up on a stretcher on his way to the medical bay. Petrovich led the way, and Lister followed, flanked by 2 unnecessary security guards. They stopped at the door to the stasis booth. "Last chance, Lister. Where's the cat?" Lister just shook his head. 3 years in stasis for some stupid flea-bitten moggy? Are you crazy? Lister wasn't crazy. Far from it. He'd first heard about the stasis punishment from Peterson. Now that the booths were no longer used for interstellar travel, their only official function was penal. Lister had spent 6 long, boring evenings shortly after Kochanski had finished with him, poring over the 3,000-page ship regulation tome, and had finally tracked down the obscure clause. The least serious crime for which stasis was a statutory punishment was breaking quarantine regulations. When Red Dwarf had stopped for supplies at Miranda, he'd spent the last afternoon of his 3-day ship leave and all his wages buying the smallest, healthiest animal with the best pedigree he could find. For $3,000 he'd purchased a black long-hair cat with the show name Frankenstein. He'd had her inoculated for every known disease to ensure that she didn't actually endanger the crew, and smuggled her aboard under his hat. A week later, he started to panic. The ship's security system still hadn't detected Frankenstein's presence. It was tricky. On the one hand, he wanted to get caught with the cat, but he didn't want the cat to get caught and dissected. Eventually, he hit on the idea of having his photograph taken with the cat and sending the film off to be developed in the ship's lab. Finally, and much to his relief, they'd caught him. 3 years in stasis was everything he'd hoped for. Okay, his wages would be suspended, but it was a small price to pay for walking into a stasis booth and walking out a subjective instant later in orbit around the Earth. He'd hidden Frankenstein in the ventilation system. The system was so vast she would be impossible to catch, and also provided her with access for foraging raids to the ship's food stores. So all in all, as Lister stepped into the stasis booth, he was feeling pretty pleased with himself, or at least as pleased as anyone could expect to feel who was actually as miserable as hell. Petrovich gave him one last chance to surrender the cat, which Lister naturally refused. As the cold metal door slammed behind him, he sat on the cold smoothness of the booth's bench and exhaled. Suddenly, a warm green light flooded the chamber, and Lister became a non-event mass with a quantum probability of 0. He ceased, temporarily, to exist. "2017. A red warning light failed to go on in the drive room, beginning a chain of events which would lead, in a further 23 minutes, to the total annihilation of the entire crew of the Red Dwarf. 2018. Rimmer was released from the medical bay and told to take 24 hours sick leave. He was halfway along Corridor 5, Delta 333, on his way back to his sleeping quarters, when he changed his mind and decided to spend the evening in a stasis booth. The medical orderly had informed him of the Lister situation, and that just about capped a perfect day in the life of Arnold J. Rimmer. On top of everything, Lister was about to gain 3 years on him. By the time they got back to Earth, Lister would be exactly the same age, while he would be 3 years older. Even with his illicit stasis boothing, Rimmer could only hope to snatch 3 months, 4 at best. So Lister would gain 2 3/4 whole years, and he was already younger than Rimmer to start with. It just seemed totally unfair. To cheer himself up, he decided to spend the evening in a state of non-being, and vowed to begin work in the morning on an appeal against Lister's sentence, so he could get him out of the stasis booth and make him start aging again. 2023. Navigation Officer Henri Dubois knocked his black Kona coffee with 4 sugars over his computer console keyboard. As he mopped up the coffee, he noticed 3 red warning blips on his monitor screen, which he wrongly assumed were the result of his spillage. 2024. Rimmer got out of the lift on the main stasis floor and made a decision which, in retrospect, he would regret forever. He decided to comb his hair. 2031. The cadmium-2 coolant system located deep in the bowels of the engine corridors stopped functioning. 2036. Rimmer stood in the main washroom on the stasis deck and combed his hair. He combed his hair in the usual way, then decided to see what it would look like if he parted it on the opposite side. It didn't look very good, so he combed it back again. He washed his hands, dried them on a paper towel. If he had left at this point and gone directly to a stasis booth, he wouldn't have died. But instead, he was seized by one of his frequent superstition attacks. He rolled the paper towel into a ball and decided if he could throw it directly into the disposal unit, he would eventually become an officer. He took careful aim, decided on an overarm shot, and tossed his paper ball. It missed by 8 feet. He retrieved the paper and decided if he got it in the disposal unit 3 times on the run, it would make up for the miss. The miss would then be struck off from the superstition record, and not only would he become an officer, but within 3 weeks he would get to have sex with a beautiful woman. Standing directly above the disposal unit, he dropped and retrieved the paper ball 3 times. Combing his hair one last time, he left the washroom, idly wondering just who the beautiful girl might be, and headed for a stasis booth. 2040. The cadmium-2 core reached critical mass and unleashed the deadly power of a neutron bomb. The ship remained structurally undamaged, but in 0.08 seconds, everyone on the engineering level was dead. 2040 and 2.7 seconds. Rimmer placed his hand on the wheel lock of stasis booth 1344. He heard what sounded like a nuclear wind roaring down the corridor towards him. It was, in fact, a nuclear wind roaring down the corridor towards him. What now? He thought rather irritatedly, and was suddenly hit full in the face by a nuclear explosion. 0.57 seconds before he expired, Rimmer realized he was going to die. His life didn't flash before him. He didn't think of his parents, or his brothers, or his home. He didn't think of the failed exams or the wasted time in the stasis booths. He didn't even think about his one brief love affair with Yvonne Magruder, the ship's female boxing champion. What he did in fact think of was a bowl of soup. A bowl of gazpacho soup. Then he died. Then everyone died. Deep in the belly of Red Dwarf, safely sealed in the cargo hold, Frankenstein nibbled happily from a box of fish paste, while 4 tiny, sightless kittens suckled noisily beneath her. The hatch to the stasis booth zazunged open, and a green "Exit Now" sign flashed on and off above Lister's head. Holly's digitalized face appeared on the 8-foot square wall monitor. "It is now safe for you to emerge from stasis." "I only just got in." "Please proceed to the drive room for debriefing." Holly's face melted into the smooth greyness of the blank screen. "But I only just got in," insisted Lister. He walked down the empty corridor towards the express lift. What was that smell? A musty smell, like an old attic. He knew that smell. It was just like the smell of his grandmother's cellar. He'd never noticed it before. And what was that noise? A kind of hissing buzz. The air conditioning? Why could he hear the air conditioning? He'd never heard it before. He suddenly realized it wasn't what he was hearing that was odd. It was what he wasn't hearing. Apart from the white noise of the air conditioning, there was no other sound, just the lonely squeals of his rubber soles on the corridor floor. And there was dust everywhere, curious mounds of white dust lying in random patterns. "Where is everybody?" Holly projected his face onto the floor in front of Lister. "They're dead, Dave," he said solemnly. "Who is?" asked Lister absently. Softly. "Everybody, Dave." "What?" Lister smiled. "Everybody's dead, Dave." "What? Everybody?" "Yes, everybody's dead, Dave." "What? Peterson?" "Yes, they're all dead. Everybody is dead, Dave." "Burrows?" Holly sighed. "Everybody is dead, Dave." "Selby?" "Yes." "Not Chen?" "Gordon Bennett," Holly snapped. "Yes, Chen. Everybody's dead, Dave." "Even the captain?" "Yes, everybody." Lister squeaked along the corridor. A tick in his left cheek pulled his face into staccato smiles. He wanted to laugh. Everybody was dead. Why did he want to laugh? No, they couldn't all be dead. Not everybody. Not literally everybody. "What about Rimmy?" "He's dead, Dave. Everybody is dead. Everybody is dead, Dave. Dave, everybody is dead." Holly tried all 4 words in every possible permutation, with every possible inflection, finishing with, "Dead, Dave, everybody is. Everybody is, Dave, dead." Lister looked blankly in no particular direction, while his face struggled to find an appropriate expression. "Wait," he said after a while. "Are you telling me everybody's dead?" Holly rolled his eyes and nodded. The enormous drive room echoed with silence. The banks of computers on autopilot whirred about their business. "Holly?" Lister's small voice resonated in the giant chamber. "What are these piles of dust?" The dust lay on the floors, on chairs, everywhere, all arranged in small, neat dunes. Lister dipped his finger in one and tasted it. "That," said Holly from his huge screen, "is Console Executive Imran Sanchez." Lister's tongue hung guiltily from his mouth, and he wiped the white particles which had once formed part of Flight Coordinator Imran Sanchez onto his jacket cuff. "So, what happened?" Holly told him about the cadmium-2 radiation leak, how the crew had been wiped out within seconds, how he'd headed the ship pell-mell out of the solar system to avoid spreading nuclear contamination, and how he'd had to keep Lister in stasis until the radiation had reached a safe background level. "So, how long did you keep me in stasis?" 3 million years, said Holly as casually as he could. Lister acted as if he hadn't heard. 3 million years. It had no meaning. If it had been 30 years, he would have thought, "What a long time." But 3 million years? 3 million years was just stupid. He wandered over to the chair opposite the console he'd seen Kochanski operate. "So, Chrissy's dead?" he said, staring at the hummock of dust. I always... His voice tailed away. He tried to remember her face. He tried to remember the pinball smile. Well, if it's any consolation, said Holly, if she had survived, the age difference would be insurmountable. I mean, you're 24, she's 3 million. It takes a lot for a relationship with that kind of age gap to work. Lister wasn't listening. I always thought we'd get back together. I had this sort of plan that one day I'd have enough money to buy a farm on Fiji. There's cheap land there, and in a half-assed kind of way, I always pictured she'd be there with me. This was getting morbid. Holly tried to lighten the atmosphere. Well, he said, she wouldn't be much use to you on Fiji now. No, said Lister. Not unless it snowed, said Holly, and you needed something to grip the path with. Lister screwed up his face in distaste. Holly! Sorry. I've been on my own for 3 million years. I'm just used to saying what I think. For some time now, well, the last 200,000 years to be exact, Holly had grown increasingly concerned about himself. For a computer with an IQ of 6,000, it seemed to him he was behaving in a more and more erratic way. In fact, he'd long suspected he'd gone a bit peculiar. Just as a bachelor who spends too much time on his own gradually develops quirks and eccentricities, so a computer who spends 3 million years alone in deep space can get, well, set in his ways, become quirky, go a little bit odd. Holly decided not to burden Lister with this anxiety, and hoped his oddness would eventually sort itself out, now he had a bit of company. Another slight concern which he tried to put to the back of his ram was that, for a computer with an IQ of 6,000, there was a rather alarming amount of knowledge he seemed to have forgotten. It wasn't, on the whole, important things, but was nevertheless fairly disturbing. He knew, for instance, that Isaac Newton was a famous physicist, but he couldn't remember why. He couldn't remember the capital of Luxembourg. He could recall pi to 30,000 digits, but he couldn't say for absolute certain whether port was on the left side and starboard on the right, or whether it was the other way round. Who knocked Swansea City out of the FA Cup in 1967? He used to know. It was a mystery now. Obviously, none of this missing information was absolutely vital for the smooth running of a mining ship 3 million years out into deep space. But technically, he was supposed to know more or less everything, and frankly, there were some worrying gaps. He could remember, for instance, that in the Second Impression, 1959 publication of Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov, printed in Great Britain by the Shenval Press, London, Hertford and Harrow, page 60 was far and away the dirtiest page. But was Nabokov German or Russian? It totally eluded him. Maybe it wasn't important. Of course it wasn't important. Still, it was for Holly a source of perturbation. It's a source of perturbation, he thought. Then he wondered whether there was such a word as perturbation, or whether he'd just made it up. He didn't know that either. Oh, it was hopeless. Lister sat in the empty Copacabana Hawaiian cocktail bar and poured a triple whiskey into his double whiskey, then topped it up with a whiskey. Absently, he lit the filter end of a cigarette and tried to assimilate all the information Holly had thrown at him. Everybody was dead. Everybody. He'd been in stasis 3 million years. 3 million years. Since one drunken night outside the Mary Lloyd off Regent Street, London, every step he'd taken had led him further and further from home. First it was Mimas, then Miranda, and now he was 3 million years away. 3 million years out into deep space, further than any human being had ever been before. And he was totally alone. The enormity of all this was slowly beginning to sink in when Holly dropped his final bombshell, the one about the human race being extinct. What do you mean, extinct? Well, 3 million years is a very good age for a species. I mean, your average genus only survives a couple of 100,000 years max.
And that's with a clean living species like dinosaurs. Dinosaurs didn't totally screw up the environment. They just went around quietly eating things. And even then, they didn't get to clock up the big 1 mil. So the chances of the human race making it to the big 3,000,000 are practically non-existent. So I'm afraid you just have to face up to the very real possibility that your species is dead.
Much to his surprise, Lister had to let out a sob.
Were you very close?
Holly tilted his head sympathetically.
Well, yeah, I suppose you must have been, really.
That was a bit of an odd thing to say, he thought. Lister took out his shirt tail and blew his nose.
So, I'm the last human being alive?
Yeah. You never think it's going to happen to your species, do you? It's always something that happens to somebody else's.
Lister spent the next 5 days going to pieces. There seemed little point in getting dressed, and so he wandered around naked, swigging from a bottle of whiskey. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know if there was anything to do. And worst of all, he didn't much care. He slept wherever he fell, a painful, dreamless sleep. He hardly ate and drank a small lock worth of whiskey. He didn't even like whiskey, but beer was too cumbersome to carry around in sufficient quantities to achieve oblivion. He lost a stone in weight and started shouting at people who weren't there. Every evening at around 5 p.m. he'd stagger stark naked into the drive-room, and waving his whiskey bottle dangerously in the air, he'd belch incoherent obscenities at Holly's huge visage on the gigantic monitor screen. Sometimes Lister imagined he'd heard the phone ring, and he'd rush to pick it up. On the evening of the 5th day, as he staggered through the Red Dwarf shopping mall, toasting invisible crowds, he keeled over and blacked out. When he woke up in the medical unit, a man with an H on his forehead was looking down at him with undisguised contempt.
You're a hologram?
Said Lister.
So I am,
said Rimmer.
You died in the accident?
Said Lister.
So I did,
said Rimmer.
What's it like?
Death?
Rimmer mused.
It's like going on holiday with a group of Germans.
He cradled his head in his hands.
I'm so depressed. I want to weep. To be cut down in my prime. A boy of 31 with the body of a 30-year-old. It's unbearable. All my plans, my career, my future, everything hinged on my being alive. It was mandatory. What happened to me? Did I black out? Excuse me, I'm talking about my being dead. Sorry, I thought you'd finished. I'm so depressed, repeated Rimmer. So depressed.
Over the next couple of days, Lister slowly recovered in the medical bay. One morning, while Rimmer was off reading the How to Cope with Your Own Death booklet for the 15th time, Lister took the opportunity to ask Holly why he'd brought Rimmer back.
You'd gone to pieces. You couldn't cope. You needed a companion.
But Rimmer?
I did a probability study,
lied Holly.
And it turns out Rimmer is absolutely the best person to keep you sane.
Rimmer?
Holly's disembodied head tilted forward in a nod.
Why not Peterson?
A man who buys a methane-filled 24-bedroom bijou residence on an oxygenless moon, whose only distinction is that it rotates in the opposite direction from its mother planet? You seriously expect me to bring him back to keep you sane? Gordon Bennett. He couldn't even keep himself sane, let alone anyone else.
Yeah, but at least we had things in common.
The only thing you had in common was your mutual interest in consuming ridiculous amounts of alcohol.
Selby? Chen?
Ditto.
What about Chrissy?
Dave, she finished with you.
But Rimmer? Anyone would have been better than Rimmer. Anyone. Hermann Goering would have been better than Rimmer. All right, he was a drug-crazed Nazi transvestite, but at least we could have gone dancing.
It was Jean-Paul Sartre,
said Holly, thinking it may very well have actually been Albert Camus or Flaubert, or perhaps it was even Sacha Distel.
who said hell was being trapped for eternity in a room with your friends.
Sure, said Lister, but all Sartre's mates were French.
I think I'm thinking, therefore I might possibly be,
Rimmer said aloud as he padded silently around the sleeping quarters in his hologrammatic slippers. Try as he might, he couldn't even begin to grapple with the metaphysics of it all.
I think I might be thinking, therefore I may possibly be being.
To Rimmer it was incomprehensible mumbo-jumbo. It was more baffling than the three-dimensional foreplay diagrams in Lister's zero-gravity sex manual. He hated being dead. When he was a boy on Io, he remembered witnessing an Equal Rights for the Dead march, where holograms from all the moons of Jupiter had rallied for better conditions. The dead were generally given short shrift throughout the solar system. They were banned from most hotels and restaurants. They found it almost impossible to hold down a decent job. And even on television, although holograms featured occasionally, they were generally only included as token deads. Not a single golf club throughout known space had a dead member. The living had a very uncomfortable relationship with holograms in general, reminding them, as they did, of their own mortality. Also, there was a natural resentment towards deadies. To become a hologram outside of the Space Corps, you had to be one of the mega-rich. The horribly expensive computer runtime and the massive power supply that was needed kept hologrammatic afterlife very exclusive indeed. Sitting on his brother, Frank's shoulders, the 6-year-old Rimmer had booed and jeered with the rest of the crowd. Encouraged by Frank, he'd actually personally thrown a stone, which had passed silently through the back of a hologram woman marching in line.
Deadies! Dirty deadies!
And now he was one of them. A dirty deadie. Well, he wasn't going to let it get him down anymore. He wasn't going to let it stand in his way. He was dead. There was no use bleating about it. Was that a reason to quit? Did Napoleon quit when he was dead? Did Julius Caesar quit when he was dead? Well, yes. But that was before the hologram was invented. And that was the advantage he had over two of the greatest men in history. He may not have been the most successful person who ever lived when he was alive, but by God he'd make up for that in his death. There was still that ziggurat to climb. There was still that gold bar to achieve. Nelson had one eye and one arm. Caesar was an epileptic. Napoleon, the man himself, suffered so badly from gonorrhea and syphilis he could barely pee. It seemed a veritable boon to Rimmer that the only disability he appeared to have was being dead. First thing tomorrow, he thought, I'm going to get the Scutters to paint a sign to hang over my bunk. And he pictured it in his mind's eye on polished oak. Tomorrow is the first day of the rest of your death. A sound like a buzzsaw played through an open-air rock festival's PA system awoke Rimmer from a dream about his mother chasing him through a car park with a submachine gun. He swung his legs over the bunk and tried to locate the sound of the buzzsaw played through an open-air rock festival's PA system. It was Lister, snoring. The snore drilled into Rimmer's skull, perfectly even, up and down, followed by a Qatari trill, and then the worst part of it all, the silence. The silence that always made him think Lister had stopped snoring. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. He has stopped snoring. 4 seconds, 5... Then the snort. Then the revolting, semi-choking sound as the mucus shifted around his cavernous nasal system and back onto the perfectly even snore. Rimmer stood up and leaned over Lister's sleeping form. There was a half-empty metal curry tray lying on his chest, which rose and fell in rhythm with his grinding snore. Rimmer's first impulse was to reach over and pinch his nose, but of course he couldn't. He couldn't shake him either, or turn him on his side. He couldn't even take a thin piece of piano wire and slowly garrote him. And if he hadn't been a hologram, this would definitely have been his favourite option. He arched over until his mouth was in whispering distance of Lister's ear. Then he screamed.
Stop snoring, you filthy son of a bastard's bastard!
Lister jerked awake.
What? You were snoring? Eh? You were snoring?
Oh,
said Lister, lying back down.
sorry.
Within 3 seconds, Lister was back asleep, and within 10, he was snoring again. The man was impossible to live with. He was an animal. He was an orangutan. He was a hippo. He was like one of those little grey monkeys you see at the zoo who openly masturbate whenever you go around with your great-aunt Florrie. He was quite the most revoltingly heinous creature it had ever been Rimmer's misfortune to encounter. What further proof did you need that God did not exist? As if he'd allow this onion to become the last surviving member of the human race. He symbolized everything that was cheap and low and nasty and tacky about mankind. Why him? A man whose idea of a change of clothing was to turn his t-shirt inside out, so the stench was on the outside. Who used orange peel and curry cartons as makeshift ashtrays. Who would frequently tug out a huge great lump of rotting, fetid meat from one of the cavities in his teeth and announce proudly that it could feed a family of 4. Who bit his nails, his toenails. He would actually sit there with his foot in his mouth and trim his nails by biting them. And then, the most hideous thing of all, he would eat the cuttings. Eating your toenails, for God's sake! This was the last man, the last human being. A person who could belch La Bamba after 11 pints of lager. A man who ate so many curries he sweated Madras sauce. Revolting. His bed sheets looked like someone had just given birth to a baby on them. And he destroyed things. Not on purpose. He was just such a clumsy, slobby, ham-fisting son of a prostadroid. Somehow he always destroyed things. Rimmer remembered once showing him a photograph of his mother, and 5 seconds later turned round to see him absently using it as a toothpick. He once lent him his favourite album, and it came back with a footprint over Reggie Dixon's Hammond organ. And raspberry? On a record? Who listens to Hammond organ music and eats raspberry jam? And the inner sleeve was missing. And there was a telephone number and a doodle on the lyric sheet. Destroyed! How could anyone possibly live with this man? How could it be that here, snoring like an asthmatic warthog, was the last representative of the human race? How was it possible that this man was alive while he was dead? How? 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 Only 2 days earlier, Lister had finally got round to collecting all his personal belongings from vacuum storage, and now here he was, sitting on his bunk, packing them all up again to take them back to vacuum storage. He'd asked Holly to turn the ship around and head back to Earth. Maybe the human race was extinct. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe they'd evolved into a race of super beings. Maybe they'd wiped one another out in some stupid war and the ants had taken over. But where else was there to go? Earth was home. He had to find out if it still existed, even if it did take another 3 million years to get back. So he decided to go back into stasis. What else was there to do? He certainly had no intention of hanging around with only a highly neurotic dead man for company. He looked down at his vacuum storage trunk. He really did have a pretty feeble collection of belongings. 4 cigarette lighters, all out of gas, a copy of the pop-up Kama Sutra, zero-gravity version, a hard ball of well-chewed gum, which he'd bought at a bar in Mimas from a guy who guaranteed it had once been chewed by Chelsea Brown, the famous actress, a pair of his adoptive grandmother's false teeth, which he'd kept for 2 reasons, A, sentimental, and B, they were just the thing for opening bottles of beer. His bass guitar with 2 strings, both G, 350 0G football magazines, and his entire collection of Rastabilly Skank DAT tapes. And, of course, there were his goldfish. He wandered over to the 3-foot-long oblong tank and peered into the murky green water. At first, he couldn't see a thing through the slimy silt. He flicked on the underwater illumination switch and pressed his face to the side of the tank. Gradually, through the gloom, he made out a moving silhouette. As his eyes adjusted, he saw it was Lennon, swimming happily in and out of the fake plastic Vatican. But he couldn't see McCartney. He rolled up his sleeve and swirled his arm around in the stagnant filth. A pungent, evil smell was disturbed from its slumber. Finally, he located the missing fish, lodged in the papal balcony above St. Peter's Square. It was dead. He shook his head and smacked the fish violently against the corner of Rimmer's slanting architect's desk, then held the fish to his ear and listened. Nothing. Picking up Rimmer's Space Scout knife, he flicked out a blade and opened up the fish like a watch. There was the problem, a loose battery. He prodded it back into place and snapped the fish closed. McCartney blinked back into life. He dropped the Piskeen droid into the water and watched as it happily swam off through the arch of the plastic Sistine Chapel, backwards.
Yes,
said Lister.
Brutal.
Rimmer walked in through the hatchway and spotted Lister's vacuum trunk.
What are you doing?
Rimmer listened in mounting disbelief as Lister outlined his plan.
What about me? What am I supposed to do on my own for 3 million years?
I don't know. I haven't really thought about it.
No, exactly.
Come on, you can't expect me to hang around here. Why don't you get Holly to turn you off till we get home?
Because, Dingleberry Brain,
Rimmer rose to his feet.
If by some gigantic fluke the Earth still exists, and if by an even greater stretching of the laws of probability the human race is still alive, and if during the 6 million years we've been away they haven't evolved into some kind of super race, and we can still understand them, if all that comes to pass, when we get back to Earth, the reasons for me being brought back as a hologram will no longer apply, and my personality disk will be packed neatly away in some dusty vault that nobody ever goes in, and that will be the end of Rimmer Arnold J.
You never know. When we get back, it might turn out that they found a cure for death.
Rimmer sucked his cheeks in and rolled his eyes around in their sockets.
Well, you never know,
said Lister feebly.
Oh yes, I expect doctors' waiting rooms are absolutely heaving with cadavers. Ah, Mrs. Harrington, dropped dead again, eh? Never mind. Rimmer mimed, scribbling a prescription. Take 2 of these 3 times a day and try not to get run over by another bus.
I'm going into stasis,
said Lister, picking up his vacuum trunk.
And that's that. You don't seriously expect me to spend the rest of my life alone here with you?
Why not?
50-odd years, alone with you.
What's wrong with that?
Lister stopped and put down his trunk.
I think we should get something straight.
I think there's something you don't understand,
What?
said Rimmer. The thing is, said Lister as kindly as he could, I don't actually like you. Rimmer stared unblinking. This really was news to him. He didn't like Lister, but he always thought Lister liked him. Why on Io shouldn't he like him? What was there not to like? Since when? He said with a slight crack in his voice. Since the second we first met. Since a certain taxi ride on Mimas.
That wasn't me! That guy in the false moustache who went into an android brothel? That wasn't me!
Rimmer was outraged at Lister's accusation. Even though it was true, he felt it was so out of kilter with his own image of himself, he was able to summon up genuine indignation. As if he, Arnold J. Rimmer, would pay money to a lump of metal and plastic to have sexual intercourse with him. It just wasn't like him. True, he did it, but it wasn't like him.
I've never been to an android brothel in my life, and if you so much as mention it again, I'll...
Rimmer faltered. He suddenly realized there wasn't very much he could do to Lister. I don't get it. What point are you trying to make?
The point I'm trying to make, you dirty son of a fetid whoremonger's bitch, is that we're friends.
Rimmer smiled as warmly as he could to help disguise the massive incongruity he'd walked straight into. Sniff your coffee and wake up, Rimmer. We're not friends.
I know what you're referring to.
Rimmer nodded his head vigorously.
It's because I gave you a hard time since you came aboard, isn't it? But don't you see? I had to do that to build up your character, to change the boy into a man.
Oh, do smeg off.
I always thought you saw me as a sort of big brother character. Heck, we don't always get on. But then, what brothers do? Cain didn't always get on with Abel.
He killed him?
Absolutely. But underneath all that, they were still brothers with brotherly affection. Heaven knows I didn't always get on with my brothers. In fact, once, when I was 14, I needed mouth-to-mouth resuscitation after all three of them held my head down a toilet for rather too long. But we laughed about it afterwards, when I'd started breathing again.
You're not going to persuade me not to go into stasis. I am not spending the rest of my life with a man who keeps his underpants on coat hangers. Rimmer held up his outspread palms in a gesture of innocence.
I'm not trying to persuade you.
Then what's all this about?
I don't know. I'm not sure what anything's about anymore.
Here comes the emotional blackmail, thought Lister.
It's not easy, you know, being dead.
Lister grunted.
It's so hard to come to terms with. I mean, death. Your own death. I mean, you have plans. So many things you wanted to do, and now...
Look, I'm sorry you're dead, okay? It was cruddy luck. But you've got to put it behind you. You're completely obsessed by it.
Obsessed?
It's all you ever talk about.
Well, pardon me for dying.
Frankly, Rimmer, it's very boring. You're like one of those people who are always talking about their illnesses.
Well,
said Rimmer, his eyes wide in astonishment. It's just boring. Change the disc. Flip the channel. Death isn't the handicap it once was. For Smeg's sake, cheer up.
Well,
said Rimmer, and he couldn't think of anything else to say, so he said,
well,
again. And quite honestly, the prospect of hanging around and having to listen to you whining and moaning and bleating and whinging for the next 3/4 of a century because you happen to have snuffed it does not exactly knock me out.
Well,
said Rimmer. 50 years alone with you? I'd rather drink a pint of my own diarrhea.
Well,
or a pint of someone else's, come to that. Every hour, on the hour, for the next 70 years.
I can't believe...
Rimmer was shaking.
You've just said that.
Holly faded into focus on the sleeping quarters vid screen.
Oi,
he said, rather uncomputer-like.
I've just opened the radiation seals to the cargo decks, and there's something down there.
What do you mean?
Some kind of life form.
What is it?
I can only see it on the heat scanner. I don't know what it is. I only know what it isn't.
What isn't it then?
It isn't human.
Lister clutched the bazookoid, the heavy portable rock-blasting mining laser, to his chest, and checked again that the pack on his back was registering full charge. Light flitted through the wire mesh of the rickety lift as it clumsily jutted its way down into the bowels of the ship. 3 miles of lift shaft, over 500 floors, most of them stretching the 6-mile length of the ship. These were the cargo decks, where all the supplies were stored. The tiny exposed cage shuddered and rocked slowly past floor after floor. Down, perhaps 20 floors of food, vacuum-sealed tin mountains stretching out beyond vision. Down, 4 floors of wood, 1,000,000 chopped trees stacked in silent pyramids. Down, floors of mining equipment. Down, floors of raw silicates mined from Ganymede. Down, floors of water stored and still in enormous glass tanks. And down. And the only sound was the metallic squealing of the lift cable as it plunged them deeper and deeper into the gloomy abyss.
I don't know why I'm scared. I'm a hologram. Whatever it is, it can't do anything to me.
Thanks. That makes me feel really secure. The gloom enveloped them. The light on Lister's mining helmet cut only 20 feet into the darkness. Lister flipped down the helmet's night visor and switched the beam to infrared. Down. Then something strange. These floors were empty. Hundreds of cubic miles of supplies were missing. Food, metal, wood, water, missing.
It's gone.
What has?
Rimmer squinted blindly into the darkness.
Everything.
What do you mean, everything?
All the supplies. The last 10 floors. They were all empty.
I'm so glad I'm already dead. I'm so glad.
You want to shut the smeg up?
Down. D-O-W-N. In the bottom right-hand corner of Lister's visor, a small green cross began to flicker.
Oh, smeg. There is something here.
Where?
The cross crept up the visor. Lister wanted to say,
The next floor.
but he couldn't. He couldn't speak. The lift coughed to a stop. The whine of the motor faded to nothing. There it was. Stretching before them, 6 miles in length, half-lit and desolate. A huge, impossible city. A city. The lift doors folded open, ch-chunk, and they stepped out onto the rough, cobbled street. Crudely fashioned igloo-shaped dwellings lined the roadway, hummocks of carved wood without doorways. Each had only a slit, perhaps a yard wide and less than a foot high, cut 6 feet from the ground. Lister checked the charge on the bazookoid backpack, and they both started cautiously down the street. Before them was a crossroads. The igloo hummocks stretched out in every direction. The flashing cross in Lister's visor throbbed more insistently, and indicated they should turn right.
What is this place?
Lister slung the bazookoid over his shoulder and scrambled up one of the hummocks. He poked his head through the slit and peered into the dim interior.
Some kind of house, but it's tiny. Just enough room for 2 people to crouch in and peer out of the gash at the top. Whatever lived here really liked confined spaces.
Built into a tiny recess in the wall was a small bookcase containing 6 books. Lister reached in and managed to grab 3 of them. He dropped down from the hummock. Rimmer peered over his shoulder as he opened each book in turn. Every single page in every book was blank. Lister slipped the books into his haversack, grabbed the bazookoid, rechecked the charge, and they moved off again. After 5 minutes or so, they reached a square. Rows of benches faced a television screen, attached to a video recorder. Lister ejected the disc. It bore the ship's regulation supply logo.
What is it?
Asked Rimmer.
The Flintstones?
They turned left. More hummocks. Another square, but this time set out like a street cafe. tables with parasols, wooden chairs, and in the centre, a table fully laid, with 2 gold candelabra, both lit. A meal, half-eaten, lay steaming on a plate. The blip on Lister's visor was pulsing faster than ever.
It's here?
Lister's finger tightened on the beam button of the bazookoid.
Whatever it is, it's right here.
A flash. A pink blur flashed from the top of a hummock, pinning Lister to the floor and sending the weapon scuttering across the cobbles. Rimmer watched, half paralyzed as the pink neon-suited man with immaculate coiffure sniffed Lister, looked up with a puzzled expression, sniffed him more deeply, then finally got to his feet, took out a clothes brush and smoothed out his suit.
Sorry, man,
he said.
I thought you were food.
From the moment he discovered that the cadmium-2 had achieved critical mass, Holly had less than 15 nanoseconds to act. He sealed off as much of the ship as possible, the whole cargo area and the ship's supply bay. Simultaneously, he set the drive computer to accelerate far beyond the dull green-blue disk of Neptune in the distance, and out into the abyss of unknown space. Then he read the Bible, the Koran, and other major religious works. He covered Islam, Zoroastrianism, Mazdaism, Zarathustrianism, Dharma, Brahmanism, Hinduism, Vedantism, Jainism, Buddhism, Hinayana, Mahayana, Brahmaism, Sikhism, Shintoism, Taoism, and Confucianism. Then he read all of Marx, Engels, Freud, Jung, and Einstein. And to kill the remaining few nanoseconds, he skipped briefly through Joe Klump's Zero-G Football, It's a Funny Old Game. At the end of this, Holly came to 2 conclusions. First, given the whole sphere of human knowledge, it was still impossible to determine the existence or not of God. And second, Joe Klump should never have been allowed anywhere near a ghostwriter. In the hold, Frankenstein's 4 offspring began to breed. Each litter produced an average of 4 kittens, 3 times a year. At the end of the first year, the second generation of kittens started to breed too. They also produced 3 litters a year, of 3 to 4 kittens. When Frankenstein died, at the great old age of 14, she left behind 198,732 cats. 198,732 cats who continued to breed. Still Red Dwarf accelerated. Holly witnessed at first hand phenomena which had never been witnessed before. He saw phenomena which had only been guessed at by theoretical physicists. He saw a star form. He saw another star die. He saw a black hole. He saw pulsars and quasars. He saw twin and triplet sun systems. He saw sights Copernicus would have torn his eyes out for. But all the while, he couldn't stop thinking how bad that book was by Joe Klump. The cats continued to breed. Red Dwarf continued to accelerate. The 40-square-mile cargo hold was seething with cats, a sea of cats. A sea of cats sealed from the radiation-poisoned decks above, with nowhere to go. Only the smartest, the biggest, and the strongest survived. The mutations. The mutations who had rudimentary fingers instead of claws, who stood on their hind legs and clubbed rivals to death with crudely made clubs, who found the best breeding mates, and bred. Felis erectus was born. Red Dwarf still accelerating past 5 stars in concentric orbits, performing a breathtaking, mind-boggling stellar ballet. Not that Holly noticed. He'd been on his own now for 2 million years, and was no longer interested in mind-boggling stellar ballets. What he was really into was Netta Musket novels. The young doctor had just told Gemma she had only 3 years to live, as he held her in his powerful masculine grip, his dark, brooding eyes piercing her very soul. Outside, the suns danced into a perfect pentagon and span end over end like a gigantic Catherine wheel. But Holly didn't see it. He was too busy reading Tomorrow is Ours. Then there was a plague. And the plague was hunger. Less than 30 cat tribes now survived, roaming the cargo decks on their hind legs in a desperate search for food. But the food had gone. The supplies were finished. Weak and ailing, they preyed at the silver mountains in their supply hold, huge towering acres of metal rocks, which in their pagan way the mutant cats believed watched over them. Amid the wailing and the screeching, one cat stood up and held aloft the sacred icon, the icon which had been passed down as holy and one day would make its use known. It was a piece of V-shaped metal with a revolving handle on its head. He took down a silver rock from the silver mountain while the other cats cowered and screamed at the blasphemy. He placed the icon on the rim of the rock and turned the handle. And the handle turned, and the rock opened. And inside the rock was alphabetti spaghetti and tomato sauce. And in the other rocks were even more delights: sugar-free baked beans, chicken and mushroom toasty toppers, faggots in rich meaty gravy, all sealed in perfect vacuums, preserved from the ravages of time. God had spoken, and Felis Sapiens was born. Holly was gurning. He was pulling his pixelized face into the most bizarre and ludicrous expressions he could muster. He'd been gurning now for nearly 2,000 years. It wasn't much of a hobby, but it helped pass the time. He was beginning to worry that he was going computer senile, driven crazy by loneliness. What he needed, he decided, was a companion. He would build a woman. A perfectly functioning human woman, capable of independent thought and decision-making, identical to a real woman in the minutest detail. The problem was, he didn't know how. He didn't even know what to make the nose out of. So he gave the whole scheme up as a bad idea and started gurning again. And there was a war between the cats. A bloody war that laid waste many of their number. But the reason was good. The cause was sensible. The principle was worth fighting over. It was a holy war. Some of the cats believed the one true father of catkind was a man called Cloyster, who saved Frankenstein, the Holy Mother, and was frozen in time by the evil men who sought to kill her. One day Cloyster would return to lead them to Birth, the planet where they could make their home. The other cats believed exactly the same thing, except they believed the name of the true father of catkind was a man called Clister. They spent the best part of 2,000 years fighting over this huge, insuperable theological chasm. Millions died. Finally, a truce was called. Commandeering the fleet of shuttles from the docking bay, half the cats flew off in one direction in search of Cloyster and the Promised Planet, and the other half flew off in the opposite direction in search of Clister and the Promised Planet. Behind them, they left the ones who were too weak to travel, the old, the lame, the sick, and the dying. And one by one, they died. Soon only two remained, one a cripple, one an idiot. They snuggled together for warmth and companionship, and one day, to the cripple and the idiot, a son was born. So the last human being alive, a man who had died, and a creature who'd evolved from cats, stood around the metal table that was bolted to the floor of the sleeping quarters and listened to a computer with an IQ of 6,000 who couldn't remember who'd knocked Swansea City out of the 1967 FA Cup explain what the hell was happening.
"So he's a cat,"
said Lister for the 14th time. The cat took a small portable steam iron out of his pocket and started pressing the sleeve of his jacket. Outwardly, at least, he was human in appearance. There was a slight flattening of his face, his ears were a little higher on his head, and two of his gleaming upper teeth hung down longer and sharper than the others, so they peeked whitely over his lips whenever he grinned, which he did a lot. He didn't seem to have a trace of superego. He was all ego and id, monumentally self-centered, and if he'd been a human, you would have described him as vain. But you couldn't apply human values to cats. There seemed to be very little connection between the two cultures. The invention which proved the turning point in cat history wasn't fire or the wheel. It was the steam-operated trouser press. Getting information out of the cat wasn't easy. If you asked him too many questions, he just got bored and went off to take one of the 5 or 6 showers he appeared to need daily. He didn't have a name. He found it difficult to understand the idea. He was of the unshakable conviction that he was the absolute center of the entire universe, the reason for its being, and the notion that someone might not know who he was beyond his comprehension.
What about in relationships?
Lister had persisted.
Relationships?
The cat rolled the word around on his tongue. The cats had learned English from the vast quantity of video discs and training films that were stored in the cargo decks, waiting for delivery to Triton. Even so, most human concepts eluded them.
Yeah, between a man-cat and a woman-cat. What do you call each other?
Hey, you!
What? In the entire relationship, you never refer to each other by name.
You know how long cat relationship lasts? 3 minutes. First minute's fine. Second minute you feel trapped. Third minute, you gotta leave.
The very thought of a relationship which lasted longer than 3 minutes brought the cat out into a cold sweat, and he had to go and take another hot shower. And so the evening progressed. When the cat wasn't showering or snoozing, he was preening. He appeared to have an arsenal of combs and brushes secreted about his immaculate person, none of which seemed to spoil the line of his immaculate pink suit. For the most part, details of the cat's background remained obscure. He found the concept of parents bewildering. He couldn't believe there was ever a time he wasn't born. When he put his mind to it, he did recall 2 other cats who used to be around, but most of the time they'd avoided each other. One of them, he reckoned, had probably been his mother, because she wouldn't sleep with him. In fact, she'd got quite angry at his approaches and hit him on the head with a large frying pan. The other must have been his father, a deeply religious cat, who was constantly reciting the 7 cat commandments. Thou shalt not be cool. Thou shalt not be vain. Thou shalt not have more than 10 suits. Thou shalt not partake of carnal knowledge with more than 4 members of the opposite sex at any one session. Thou shalt not slink. Thou shalt not hog the bathroom, and thou shalt not steal another's hair gel. In the dark ages of religious intolerance, these laws were laid down by cat priests to keep their race in check. It was only through denying certain lusts, certain natural urges to be cool and stylish, they said, that a cat could find redemption. Strict punishments were meted to transgressors. Cats caught slinking in public would have their shower units removed. Cats condemned as vain would have their hairdryers confiscated, and be forced to wear fashions some 2 or 3 seasons old.
Paisley? With thin lapels and turn-ups? But that was last spring! Please, no! Have mercy!
The cat finally tired of the relentless questioning and announced it was time for his main mid-evening snooze. He casually leapt up on top of Rimmer's locker, curled up in the impossibly small space, and fell immediately into a deep and satisfying sleep.
What are we going to do with him?
Rimmer asked. Lister sat at the table playing with his locks. He was thinking. Watching Lister thinking always reminded Rimmer of a huge old rusty tractor trying to plough furrows in a concrete field. Finally, he looked up.
He's coming home with us, back to Earth.
Disappointment filtered through Rimmer's brittle smile.
You're still going into stasis, then? You're taking him with you?
Why not?
No reason, he thought. No reason at all, so long as you don't give 2 short smegs about Arnold J. Rimmer.
Jump here! Jump back! Wah!
The cat slinked down the corridor, pulling a clothes rack on wheels, which was packed with suits. Blue suits, green suits, red suits, Polka dots, stripes, checks, silk suits, fur suits, plain suits. Each one he'd made himself during the years he'd been trapped down in the cargo hold.
Jump up! Jump down! Wah!
The cat span round and did a little dance without breaking stride. He reached the vacuum storage floor, where Lister was waiting impatiently. "What are you doing?"
I'm doing what you said do.
"I said bring a few basic essentials you can't leave behind,"
Right.
agreed the cat.
And this is all I'm taking. Just this and the other 10 racks. Travel light, move fast. Wah!
He span on the spot. "You can't pack all this in a vacuum storage. It'll take ages." The cat's face drooped. He'd spent the last 2 hours trying to whittle his enormous collection down to his favourite 100 suits. He'd been cruel with himself. The yellow DJ with green piping had gone. The imitation walrus hide with the fake zebra collar was history. And his red PVC morning suit with matching top hat and cane, down the tube. "You can take 2 suits," Lister said firmly. "And that's it."
2 suits?
The cat laughed mockingly.
2? Then I'm staying, buddy.
"You can't stay. When I come out, you'll be dead."
2 suits is dead.
"Pick." The cat walked up and down the racks. Then he walked up and down the racks again. Then he went behind the racks and walked up and down them that way.
How many did you say it was? 10?
2.
Oh, man.
The cat walked up and down the racks again. Lister grabbed 2 suits and thrust them roughly into the vacuum trunk. "Okay, those are the 2 you're taking." The cat picked up the arm of the first suit on the rack and shook it by the sleeve.
Bye, man.
He tapped it on its padded shoulder and went to the next one. Lister sighed. "I better say so long to Rimmer,"
Bye, baby.
said the cat to his next suit.
Gonna miss you.
Lister walked off down the corridor. "We're going into stasis in 10 minutes. I'll meet you in the sleeping quarters,"
Hey,
the cat called.
if I cut off my leg and leave it behind, can I take 3?
It didn't make sense. As Holly flicked through the 4 zillion megabytes of Navicomp data and simultaneously cross-checked the information against all the sensor status databanks, he found it impossible to avoid the conclusion that Red Dwarf was 0.002 seconds away from doing something completely impossible. It was about to break the light barrier. True, the average cruising speed for a vessel the size of Red Dwarf was 200,000 miles an hour. True, they'd been accelerating constantly for the last 3 million years. True, the ship was now clocking up 669,555,000 miles an hour, which was just 45,000 miles an hour below the speed of light. And true, in 0.0019 seconds, they would break the light barrier. The thing was, it wasn't possible. Light is the speed limit for the universe. Nothing travels faster than light. All of which was good. What wasn't so good was that Red Dwarf was about to do exactly that. In 0.0017 seconds. It didn't make sense. Holly reprogrammed the drive computer to slow down, which the drive computer did. But because they were accelerating so fast, slowing down merely meant they were accelerating slightly less quickly than they were before. However, they were still accelerating, so they were slowing down but still going faster. That didn't make much sense to Holly either. The only thing that was clear was that by the time they'd slowed down enough to be actually slowing down in the sense of going slower, rather than the kind of slowing down that meant they were actually getting faster, albeit faster more slowly, they would already have broken the light barrier, which was impossible. And they were due to do this in 0.0013 seconds. Holly hummed softly. Holly had only uncovered all this when he'd tried to chart the ship's return course to Earth. At first he'd assumed it was possible to do a 3-point turn or a loop-de-loop, but according to his calculations, it would take the best part of 350,000 years just to do a fairly sharpish U-turn. Then Holly got his plan. If he could maneuver Red Dwarf into orbit around a planet, they could use the gravitational pull to slingshot out 180 degrees later on a heading back to Earth. Brilliant! Who said he was getting computer senile? Of course, this Fancy Dan astrobatics talk was all a tiny bit irrelevant, because they were about to break the light barrier, and Holly was fairly convinced that in so doing, they would all instantly be reduced to their component atoms. And as far as he could tell, this was going to happen in 0.000 seconds. Oh dear, that was now. At the same instant, Lister was everything, and he was nothing. His mass was infinite, and his mass was non-existent. As he watched, his legs stretched out beneath him, as if he were teetering on the top of the World Trade Center, staring down at his tiny feet miles below. His face buckled and rippled. His eyelashes hung down over his face like huge palm trees. He was all colors, and he was no colors. Instinctively, he reached out an arm to steady himself, and it telescoped away across the now infinite space of the sleeping quarters, as if it were elastic. He turned to get his bearings, and found himself looking at the back of his own head. And then he was falling into himself. And when he opened his eyes, he discovered his head was in his stomach. Then just as quickly, he mushroomed back out, and his head was the shape and size of an Egyptian pyramid. He tried to walk. A mistake. His legs became hopelessly tangled. He forgot how many he had, and where they should go. Each step was like trying to construct a wayward deck chair. And then he fell over. But he didn't go down, he went up. He folded round on himself to form a perfect cylinder, and everywhere he looked, there was him. Him, 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 him. And all the hymns started screaming as they span, cutting orbits around themselves like electrons. And then it stopped. And he was just standing in front of the wash basin, his razor in his hands, looking at his soaped-up face in the mirror. Holly appeared on the sleeping quarters monitor.
"Whoops,"
he said,
"my fault.
and grinned contritely.
What happened?
We've broken the light barrier."
I thought that was impossible.
Nah, said Holly.
So, are we travelling at light speed now?
Faster.
Is everyone okay?
Rimmer's a bit shaken up. He's still running around in circles in the technical library.
What about the ship?
Well, now it's got back to its original mass, it's feeling much perkier,
said Holly, and left to devote all his available runtime to navigating a ship that was now travelling beyond measurable speed. Lister stepped into the northern hatchway of the recreation room on his way to the technical library to find Rimmer. Down the centre of the recreation room were dozens of baize-covered tables in various shapes and sizes: pool, snooker, Quarango, and flip. The walls were lined with 3D video booths. Italian Driver was Lister's favourite, one of the most thrilling and dangerous games around, the object of which was to park a car in Rome. Rimmer stepped in through the southern hatchway.
Rimmer, we've broken the light barrier.
What? Said Rimmer.
We're going faster than the speed of light.
How did I do what?
What do you mean, how did I do what?
Lister, don't be a gimboid.
I'm not being a gimboid.
How could I? I've just been in the library thinking. Anyway, I've decided... Rimmer paused for no discernible reason, then yelled, equally inexplicably, "Shut up!" and wheeled round 180 degrees and appeared to be addressing a dartboard. As I was saying before I was so rudely interrupted, I've decided when you go into stasis, I want to be left on. I want to stay behind.
Are you all right, Rimmer?
What things? Said Rimmer with a puzzled expression.
Eh?
I said what? Rimmer turned his head slowly, following some unseen object with his eyes.
What's going on?
Lister passed his hand in front of Rimmer's eyes. Rimmer stared blankly ahead. You're space crazy, Rimmer said. I'm space crazy. You're the one who's space crazy.
Well, it probably is déjà vu,
said Rimmer.
Sounds like it.
He scratched the hologrammatic H on his forehead with his long, thin finger, shook his head, then walked across to the northern hatchway and stepped out. Simultaneously, another Rimmer stepped in through the southern hatchway. Lister whipped round just in time to see the first Rimmer's back disappearing round the corner.
Rimmer,
He said to the Rimmer who'd just come in.
you just a second walked out of that door.
What?
Said this other Rimmer.
How did you do that?
Lister's head was flicking from exit to exit.
How did I do what?
Rimmer, you just went out of that door.
Lister pointed at the north exit.
And you've just come in through this one.
Lister, don't be a gimboid.
Look, I swear on me grandmother's life, as you walked out there, you came in here.
How could I? I've just been in the library thinking. Anyway, I've decided...
Rimmer, I'm telling you.
Lister walked to the centre of the room and stood with his back to the dartboard.
Shut up!
Rimmer yelled, wheeling around to face him.
As I was saying before I was so rudely interrupted, I've decided when you go into stasis, I want to be left on. I want to stay behind.
Rimmer, you've just been in and said exactly these things.
What things?
You said that. You said what things?
I said what?
And that. You said that too.
You're space crazy,
said Rimmer.
Yes,
said Lister, nodding.
and then you said it was probably déjà vu.
Well, it probably is déjà vu,
said Rimmer.
Sounds like it.
Well, go on then. Scratch your H, shake your head and walk out.
Rimmer scratched the hologrammatic H on his forehead with his long, thin finger, shook his head, and walked across to the northern hatchway and stepped out. He'd caught the lift and was heading back towards the sleeping quarters before Lister caught up with him.
Rimmer, wait, listen to me.
Suddenly the cat raced out from the sleeping quarters and ran past them, clutching a bloodied handkerchief to his mouth.
My tooth! My tooth! I think I lost my tooth!
Lister stopped.
Cat, what happened?
The cat raced by, ignoring him. Rimmer stood in the entrance to the sleeping quarters.
Look,
he said quietly. The cat was standing motionless by the bunks, his lips slightly parted in a half-smile of disbelief.
Correct me if I'm wrong, said Rimmer, but the cat just rushed past us, and now he's standing here.
Did you get him?
Said the cat to Lister. Lister turned to Rimmer.
you see, something weird is happening.
I was just sitting here,
said the cat.
just waiting like you said to wait. Then this appallingly handsome guy appeared who was an exact replica of me and started singing about fish.
It's something to do with light speed,
said Lister. Rimmer called for Holly. Holly was busy. He was busy worrying. He'd given up trying to navigate the ship at super light speed. He was fairly certain they'd already passed directly through the middle of 7 planets and at least 1 sun. It was completely impossible to avoid them, because they only appeared on his navicomp after the event. Still, for some reason the ship seemed to have survived intact, so he decided not to worry about it. Another slight concern was that red dwarfs seemed to be following another red dwarf, and they in turn seemed to be being followed by yet another. In fact, when Holly examined it closely, they seemed to be flying in a convoy of at least 26 red dwarfs. Holly reasoned he couldn't do much about it, so he decided not to worry about this either. In fact, there was nothing he could do about anything, at least not until they dropped below light speed, which, according to his calculations, was 78 hours away, although Holly had a very low opinion of his own calculations, so he wasn't going to put too much faith in that.
What? What is it? I'm busy. I'm trying to navigate.
Holly's digitalized face appeared blurry and ill-defined.
What's the problem? You've got an IQ of 6,000, haven't you?
Look, I've got to steer a ship the size of a small South American republic at speeds hitherto unencountered in the realm of human experience. We're travelling faster than the speed of light. We pass through things before I've even seen them. Even with an IQ of 6,000, it's still brown trousers time.
Just tell us what's happening.
You're seeing future echoes. Because we're travelling faster than light, we're overtaking ourselves in time. You're catching up with things you're about to do before you've actually done them. Future echoes,
he repeated.
Okay?
So, said Lister, the cat is going to break his tooth sometime in the future.
What tooth? Nobody's gonna break my tooth.
How long is this going to last?
Until the reverse thrust takes effect, and we drop below light speed.
Holly's image closed one eye and did some mental arithmetic, which was probably wrong.
73 hours and 14 minutes,
he said as confidently as he could.
Nobody is gonna break my tooth.
Look,
Rimmer spluttered.
there's another one.
A photograph was slowly materializing on Lister's bunkside table. It was a photograph of Lister. A photograph of Lister wearing a white surgical gown, standing outside the ship's medical unit. His eyes were dark and weary, but he was grinning. In his arms, wrapped in silver blankets, were 2 newly born babies.
2 babies?
Lister looked up at the cat, who was craning over his shoulder. He reached out to pick up the photograph, but his hand passed through it, and the picture slowly evaporated.
Where do we get 2 babies from? Without a woman on board?
Lister was having an argument with the dispensing machine when he heard the explosion. It was a simple dispute, and the dispensing machine was completely in the wrong. Lister had ordered his customary breakfast of prawn Bangalore fowl, half rice, half chips, 7 spicy poppadoms, a lager-flavoured milkshake, and 2 rennies. The machine had delivered a raspberry pavlova in onion gravy.
There's something wrong with your voice recognition unit.
Coming right up,
said the dispensing machine, and served up 2 lightly grilled kippers.
No, you don't understand. There's a malfunction somewhere.
No problem at all,
said the machine.
Rare, medium, or well done.
Then dispensed 43 pounds of raw calf's liver.
Forget it. Forget the food. Can you just give me a cup of coffee?
No sooner said than done,
said the machine pleasantly, and a Christmas pudding, flambéed in brandy, rolled out of the dispensing hatch onto the floor and set fire to Lister's trouser bottoms. Lister was still stamping out the Christmas pudding when the explosion rocked the ship. When he arrived breathless in the navicomp chamber, Rimmer was staring, still in shock, at the drive panel.
What was that?
shouted Lister. Slowly Rimmer turned his head and looked up.
Brace yourself for a bit of a shock. I just saw you die.
You saw what?
Well, I did warn you to brace yourself.
What? When? You didn't give me much of a chance.
I gave you ample bracing time.
No, you didn't. You didn't even pause.
Well, I'm sorry. I've just had a rather disturbing experience. I've just seen someone I know die in the most hideous way.
Yeah, me?
It was horrible.
Rimmer screwed up his face and shuddered in distaste.
You were standing by the navicomp.
I don't want to know.
You don't want to know how you die?
No, course a smeggin' don't.
Suddenly the room seemed very dark and cold to Lister.
Was it quick?
he asked quietly.
Well, I wouldn't say it was super fast. Not if you count the thrashing about and the agonized squealing.
He shuddered again.
You're enjoying this, aren't you?
What a horrible thing to say.
It was definitely me.
Yep.
Rimmer grinned.
I don't want to know about this.
He sucked at one of his locks absently.
How old did I look?
How old are you now?
25. How old did I look?
I'd say
Rimmer clicked his tongue.
mid-20s.
Smeg!
Lister got up and kicked the navicomp.
I'm not ready.
He kicked it again.
I'm not smeggin' ready.
Yes, you did seem surprised, especially when the arm came off.
So, you saw me face? You got a good look at me face? It was actually me. It was my face.
Yes, you were wearing your stupid leather deerstalker with the furry earmuffs.
Lister snatched off his leather deerstalker with the furry earmuffs.
Okay, I'll never wear a hat. I'll never wear it again. Then it can't happen.
He flung the cap across the navicomp, and it scudded along the floor. Rimmer smiled.
But it has happened. You can't change it. Any more than you can change what you had for breakfast this morning. But it hasn't happened, has it? It has, will be, have, going to have happened, but it hasn't actually happened. The point of it is, it has happened. It's just it hasn't taken place yet.
Lister stared blankly into space, playing with his hair, while Rimmer tried to wrestle back the smirk that was making a break for his face.
All right. Okay. The cat, right?
Lister got to his feet.
The cat broke his tooth in a future echo, right? I'm listening. If I can stop him breaking it, can't be done. Then I can stop me from dying. Can't be done, unfortunately. So, how would the cat break his tooth?
Lister sat quietly, tugging at a loose piece of rubber on the toe cap of his boot. Rimmer watched him, whistling a Dixieland jazz version of the Death March in Soul.
Eating something. Can't be done, me old buckaroo. Your number is up. Eating something hard. Can't be done-a-roonied, sadly.
Lister stood up, his eyes alive, and pelted out of the navicomp chamber.
Where are you going?
Rimmer got to his feet.
Me goldfish!
Lister's voice echoed from the corridor.
Trying to eat me robot goldfish! Plop. Plop, ka-plop, plop.
The cat lay listlessly on Rimmer's bunk. Several of his shirts were slung on a line across the sleeping quarters, dripping noisily into receptacles.
Plop, plop, ka-plop, plop.
He hated laundry day. It always made him tired. Wearily, he picked up another dirty shirt, unfurled his tongue, and started cleaning it with long, methodic, rough, wet licks, stopping occasionally to top up his tongue with washing-up powder. When it was finished, he hung the shirt on the line with the others.
Plop, ka-plop, plop.
He really didn't feel like attacking his sock pile right now, so he got up and started mooching around the quarters looking for something else to do. He picked a book from Rimmer's shelf and ran his nose across one or two pages, but he couldn't make any sense of it. It appeared to be covered in funny little blobs, which didn't smell of anything. Cats didn't communicate by writing. They communicated by smell. To read a piece of cat literature, you ran your nose along a line which released various scents impregnated in the page. There were 246 smell symbols in the cat lexicon. Each could be qualified by smaller, subtler smells, which altered the meaning. Symbols could also mean completely different things in different contexts. For instance, the smell for fear in a different setting could also mean very bad, noxious, toilet, or sometimes even estate agent. The cat decided to amuse himself by trying to read the contents of Lister's dirty laundry basket. Much to his surprise, some of it translated quite well into cat prose. In fact, one T-shirt contained a sentence about a fearful, very bad estate agent going to a noxious toilet. Then he noticed the goldfish. He watched them for a while. One of them was swimming backwards. He'd never actually seen a live fish, but he was aware of some primal instinct they stirred deep within his stomach. Even though he'd eaten less than an hour ago, he found a little hunger pain squeaking,
Let's eat the fish.
He had a small, half-hearted dialogue with the hunger pain, but it was fairly insistent.
Come on, let's eat the fish.
I'm not hungry.
Eat it. Eat it. Come on.
The cat put his hand into his jacket pocket and pulled out an already buttered roll. He usually kept one handy. He began his food ritual by singing mockingly at the snack.
I'm gonna eat you, little fishy. I'm gonna eat you, little fishy. I'm gonna eat you, little fishy, 'cause I like eating fish.
To give the fish a fighting chance, he stood with his back to them. Then, in a single movement, he swiveled round, flicked one of the fish out of the tank with the back of his hand, and caught it in the bread roll.
Too slow, little fishy.
He chided his goldfish sandwich.
Too slow for this cat.
He raised the squirming roll to his mouth and started to bite down through the bread.
No!
Screamed Lister. The cat half turned and saw Lister flying towards him like a berserk caber, his face contorted, his mouth forming a distorted elliptical O.
No!
The cat was still smiling, in anticipation of his fishy nibble, when Lister crashed into him. They smacked into the table and tumbled onto the hard grey deck. The fish roll skidded across the floor. Lister rolled off the softly moaning cat, grabbed it, and looked inside. McCartney was still wriggling away, intact, unbitten.
I did it.
Lister said quietly.
I did it!
He screamed not so quietly.
I did it! I got the fish! I'm not gonna die!
He did a victory dance like a zero-G ceiling receiver who just scored the winning touch-up. Rimmer stood in the doorway. The cat clambered to his feet.
My tooth!
He put a handkerchief to his mouth. It came away bloody.
You're crazy!
Lister came towards him. Let me see. The cat raced out of the sleeping quarters.
My tooth! My tooth!
He was yelling.
I think I lost my tooth!
Lister stared at the floor, at the small piece of white enamel that was lying under the chair, taunting him. A one-toothed grin.
Well,
Rimmer's smirk was as big as Yankee Stadium.
allow me to be the very first to offer my deepest commiserations.